welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit with my guest, David Quint, where we'll be discussing David's wonderful film, Father Unknown. David Quint's career as a filmmaker has spanned 25 years and countless stories, but a mystery shadowing his own family's story has always haunted him. Setting out with his father on a high-stakes trip to an orphanage in Switzerland, David recorded their desperate search for answers. Father Unknown is their uplifting true story, a feature film that brings audiences along for the ride in a deep and powerful journey in search of connection, identity, and intergenerational healing. David, I'm so looking forward to hearing more. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Indeed, I'm so excited about this. Before we dive into our conversation, though, let's go ahead and share the trailer for your film so our viewers will get a taste of what happened on your amazing journey. And we'll talk a little bit later about where people can see Father Unknown. So let's go ahead and watch the trailer.
It's been this way for as long as I can remember. I've tried to act like I don't feel it inside, but I can't escape the emptiness. I've become a man, a husband, and a father, but the past consumes me, and I am obsessed with the fragments of a story about my father. There was a castle, rows of beds. There was a boy named Urban. A letter from a woman he had never met. His mother. The past has never been spoken about, and there's always been a distance between me and my father. There is something hidden in the silence. I'm trying to get some information about a person who lived in this little village in 1941.
Oh, wait a minute.
Where am I?
You're in Switzerland.
How did I get over here? You and I are traveling together.
We've been trying to figure out who your father is. I don't know what happened.
Maybe you better just come back home. That's the end of it.
You know, there's been a lot of changes for him.
I just thought it was all good.
What is that? It's gonna be good, Dad.
All right. Okay, so we're gonna try not to share any spoilers, but there's so much to talk about. So one or two might slip in, so please forgive me. I wanted to let everyone know I've watched Father Unknown. I was completely enthralled, especially David, watching you and your father dig up clue after clue. It's such a mystery. I want to ask before we really get into the deeper conversation. What was it like for you to actually walk in your ancestral footsteps and watch your dad learn so many new things about his origins? That must have been such a unique experience.
It really was. I just got chills when you said that. Every time I'm kind of taken back to that experience, it's almost ineffable. It really is. It's hard to put into words. It was an experience that felt sort of strangely familiar in a way, and of course completely foreign at the same time. And even just to be there, if you set aside everything that happened after we arrived, something deeply powerful about just being in the place where my ancestors were with my father. So.
Yeah. It seems almost overwhelming at times. Like, for example, in the trailer we saw where your father was a little disoriented, where he wasn't even really sure where he was. Can you talk a little bit about how this actually impacted him?
Well, because his childhood had been spent at an orphanage in Switzerland, um, he was not just going back to this abstract place where his ancestors were from. He was going home. So, and it was it's a strange sort of home. It's a 700-year-old castle sitting on a hill in Switzerland. Um, and it was a very visceral experience, I think, for him to be back there. He talked about the way when we walked back into the castle, he talked about it still smells the same. So, this is 60 plus years after he was there, and this place, the smell of this place elicits feelings of being back there. So he was doing a lot of I think there was a pretty significant internal process going on for him that really he wasn't in control of. It was just, I remember being here, and I remember the way these vines grew on these particular trees in the area around the castle. So it was powerful for him to be there in a different way than it was for me.
Yeah. Well, because he actually lived there and he was having these memories, and you had no idea that this is what he had experienced. He'd been dropping little hints across the years of what his childhood was like. So this was all brand new to you, more or less. So let's talk about how has creating the film and actually sharing it with people impacted you.
If you had told me when I was 16 years old that I would grow and an angry young man, that I would grow up someday and make a heartwarming father-son film. And it would be about me and my father on top of that. I would have said there it's like that's the last thing that I ever imagined doing. Um, but of course that's what's happened. And sharing it with people has been uh, a really amazing experience. Creating the film after we came back was deeply powerful as well, and then subsequently sharing that with audiences and getting letters and emails and hearing from people about how they've been inspired to take their own journeys is just something I never could have anticipated. So it's been a very powerful is the best word I can use.
Yeah. Now, you also mentioned at the beginning of the trailer and in the film itself, you talk about how before this journey began, you looked at life a certain way. You had your own family, your wife and kids, and you felt this emptiness, this hole that you didn't really understand where it came from. So, can you talk a little bit about the healing journey that you personally went on, where your discovery of what that hole was and how you worked through that?
Well, I had carried this emptiness inside for my whole life, and it was there kind of as long as I could remember. It wasn't something that I would say was really above the level of consciousness. So if you had asked me, I wouldn't have said, "Oh, yes, hi, I'm David, and I'm carrying an emptiness inside." Um, and it's hard to put words to something that is an absence that is present. It's hard to know how to talk about that. We don't oftentimes have language for that. We're talking about the absence of something. So there was this feeling that something was missing, and I didn't really know what it was. Um, but as I got older, it kind of grew, and then I had children of my own, and was married, and it seemed like this history with my dad and the relationship that we had had, which was um, difficult and painful for me, um, had something to do with this sense of emptiness. So it wasn't a clearly kind of correlated set of circumstances, but it just seemed like there was a little bit of enough clues kind of along the way linking this stuff together that it had something to do with the type of father he had been to me, and then his background as a child, which was so mysterious.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't think this would be a spoiler here, but in the film, your dad mentions, because he grew up in an orphanage, that he honestly had no comprehension of what a family was. He didn't understand what is a mother and a father, or a brother or a sister, and so just knowing that and learning that about him, I imagine would be helpful in explaining to you why he was the kind of I'm sure he thought he was a really good father, especially compared to how he grew up. But you, as his child, are being raised by somebody who never really learned what family is.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's so relative, right? We all endeavor to be, when we become parents, hopefully a better parent than maybe the parenting that we experienced. And I think, most of the time, I think that probably is actually what happens. I don't know that our kids are kind of looking at it from that standpoint. As a kid, we want sort of everything. And I certainly know that I did. And so, um, because my father's time and origins in this orphanage were not really clear, and the impacts of that were not clear, there really wasn't a way for me to understand why he was the way he was. And so he couldn't tell me the things he didn't know. And so you're exactly right. By the time we end up back at this orphanage and start finally talking about what had happened and trying to sort of piece together this mystery, I began to learn all sorts of things that I had never considered. He told me, you see it in the film, he really struggled to sort of identify the roles that people have in a family. What's an aunt? What's an uncle? What's a sibling? Even to this day, years later since this trip, he's just now learning really what those roles mean, and it's because he didn't understand those from an early age. Um, he didn't know how old he was in this orphanage until someone told him he was 12 years old. So can you imagine? I mean, most of us remember an early birthday, maybe when we're 5 or 6, something like that, and we kind of know, oh, this symbolizes getting a year older. He didn't know any of that, and he couldn't explain that to me. When by the time he had become my father, it just wasn't something he talked about. So there were some pretty significant gaps in his childhood that most of us take for granted, and I certainly did. I wouldn't have ever thought that those sorts of things were missing from him.
Mhm. Right, right. Now, what I'm wondering then is, how on earth did you talk him into going on this trip with you? Because this was a big deal. This wasn't like it was the next town over and you went for a drive in the afternoon. You flew to the other side of the world, and your mom wasn't real thrilled about this either. So how did you convince them to go along with this?
You know, I had always wanted to find a way to talk about this, at least talk about this. And I didn't know how to do it. Certainly when I was much younger, your parents sort of set the agenda, and I knew it was a subject that nobody in the family was excited to talk about. So I really let that go. But it was always there in the back of my mind. And as I got older and maybe had a little more agency, I felt like um, it was important. And I started trying to talk about him, and I actually sort of recorded some of those attempts to talk to him about it. And the event that really changed everything is I sent an email back to this castle, if you can believe it. I found the name of this castle on the internet, and they had a very rudimentary website, which was all in German. And I'm not a German language speaker, so I wrote a desperate email and said, you know, "Dear Swiss Castle, my father was an orphan here. Um, we know very little about his childhood. Do you have any records whatsoever?" And thinking that I would never hear back, it was really just sort of a Hail Mary attempt. And a month went by or so, and I got an email back from the administrator of this castle, which was no longer an orphanage, it now is a foundation. But this administrator said, we do have some records from 1942 when my dad was born. And we have a list of children that were here at the orphanage at that time. And he emailed that list to me. It was a photograph. And it was really the first kind of artifact from my father's life that I had seen, that kind of proved that he had come from somewhere. And so seeing that piece of paper was very, again, just this powerful experience. And so, as I'm looking at that, I continued to read, and it said, we don't have any other records, but there's another man that has stopped by to visit us, and he was in the orphanage at the same time as your father. Maybe your father remembers him. So I asked my dad, and my dad said, "Yes, I do remember him. I slept in the bed next to him." And so at that point, I said, we have to go to Switzerland. We have to. I mean, just to go be in this place and to be able to talk to someone else who was there, who I'm sure will remember something about this experience, was too compelling to pass up. And so at that point, I kind of insisted, and he said, "Okay."
Wow, that's I don't even have the words to express what the thoughts going through my head. That is such a powerful moment. I mean, anybody who's a genealogy freak, knows what that feels like, to have that, oh my God, moment of discovery. So I'm getting goosebumps just hearing you talk about that. And let's go ahead and go back to the difficulty of talking about these things, especially with the older generations. I know with my family history, they never talked about. I had no idea some of the traumatic things that my ancestors went through until I got online and started doing my family tree and discovered these amazing stories. So, what are your thoughts on why it's so important to talk about these stories, even if they're difficult, and if the older generations, they just don't want to go back there?
Well, I know this from my own experience, because as it turns out, I was a person who didn't want to talk about not so much my time in an orphanage or this amazing family secret, but I didn't want to talk or really acknowledge the sort of painful emptiness that I had carried inside from my childhood. It was different from my father's, but it hurt. our relationship hurt. Um, and as it turns out, when we started looking at what had been recorded on the trip and really figuring out how to turn this into a film, we noticed that there was this kind of pattern in the family story. And it took quite a while for us to notice this, but there definitely was a pattern. There were these really sad events, um, like a woman becoming pregnant and not being able to keep her baby. This happened in our story. That baby was relinquished. That baby grew up in an orphanage. He suffered some abuse there. After each of these really compelling and dramatic and sad events, the sort of reaction to that by the people that were there, whether it was my grandmother or my dad or her family, was really a non-reaction. It was silence. And so as we moved through the story of what had happened, we kept saying, wow, it's interesting. There's something sad and it's followed by silence. And then a lot of times there was sadness about the silence. So you got sad again. And then there was silence about that. And that little two-step pattern repeated over and over and over. And the effect of that was that it disconnected the people, each of the persons in the family from, I think, their own experience and from each other. And so the antidote to that, we realized, is that if you take that pain in the family story and stuff it down and don't talk about it, you're really making fertile ground for disconnection with the people around you and the subsequent generations, which is really, I think, what we mean when we talk about, well, we really want to know our family story. I think what we really want to know is what happened and how did people feel about what happened. You know, if somebody won an amazing contest or had amazing success in their life, we can probably assume they were happy about that. But if sad things happen in a family story and it's not talked about, it really leaves, I think, us feeling bewildered, and that creates a disconnection in the family.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I love the fact that you brought up that you noticed a pattern, because that's basically what this whole ancestral healing thing is about, is recognizing these patterns that, we probably didn't even know about until we started exploring these stories. So when you discovered this family pattern of people who didn't know the previous generation, so it's not like they learned these things sitting at their mother's knee. These were things that were, passed on epigenetically, etc. So when you discovered the pattern, I'm assuming then that you recognized it playing out in your own personal life. How did you deal with the fact that you noticed, I'm now living out this pattern?
Yeah, that was, it's actually, it's quite interesting. You know, we as we were telling the story of Father Unknown, we would get 85-90% of the way through, and there was this remaining kind of piece that we just couldn't find. I couldn't figure out what that was about. And there's this pattern, like I mentioned, and it's kind of starts at the beginning and it continues all the way through. And we would even screen the film for test audiences, and they would say, oh gosh, we love this, this is amazing. What it seems like there's something about you here that we don't like. What does this have to do with you? And so, every time we're kind of going back through this material, it's pointing me closer and closer to me. And eventually I realize, oh, I'm doing it too. And that was difficult, and it was painful because there was an unacknowledged pain from my own experience as a child as a result of this story that um, I hadn't acknowledged that I had really wanted to avoid. And so it was kind of this experience of feeling the pain all along of the family story and then connecting that to myself as we were finishing the film and going, oh gosh, it's me too.
Mhm.
Um, so not an easy, comfortable experience, definitely uncomfortable, but deeply valuable on the other side of it.
Yeah, yeah. Now I can't help thinking that you said that you'd get like 85, 90% into it, and then you'd have this stopping point. It sounds to me like that's that hole, that emptiness that you grew up feeling, that was,
Yeah,
that was the
yeah.
manifestation of this.
I mean, really, it's interesting. On the other side of all this, what I can say for myself is the emptiness is actually not emptiness. The emptiness is this kind of body of pain and sadness that I wanted to keep kind of below my level of awareness. So it's really only described as emptiness until we can come to this understanding and go, it's actually not emptiness, it's sadness about XYZ event. And so in the film, we really begin describing it as an emptiness because that was the best word I had to attempt to articulate that at that point in time. In the end, though, it really is called what it is, which is the sadness about the aspects of the family story.
Right, right. Wow. So I'm wondering then, men in general, let's just stereotype here for a second, aren't well known for being in touch with their feelings, their emotions, etc. Um, how have men responded to seeing your film and maybe experiencing their own relationships with their fathers?
We've screened the film at a lot of live events across the country, and oftentimes I'll see uh, a husband or a boyfriend, a partner who's sitting in the audience, and I can tell that he's been brought to a screening by the woman in his life. And, sometimes this is a posture that without this, they kind of look like this, which is probably how I would have looked at going to see a story like this, just a little bit like, you know. And by the time the film is maybe not even halfway over, sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of that same guy and he'll have tears in his eyes. And sometimes afterwards, that same man will come up and talk to me and, oh gosh, he'll tell me a story that would make another very compelling movie. So, um, this film seems to somehow unlock something in other men that I think is a similar experience. It may not be necessarily an orphanage or being a relinquished child, um, but I think most men want a closer relationship with their father. I've yet to meet a man who doesn't, and it's not necessarily an easy thing. It hasn't been an easy thing to talk about that. And so that's why I think um, this story is so meaningful to people because it really is giving permission, in particular for men to say, yeah, I do care about this stuff. And I want to know my father. I want to be closer to him.
So I'm wondering then again, it's so hard not to give away spoilers. So I will let you answer this question as far as the journey, at least that we saw in the film, or if there's anything even outside of that. What was the biggest I guess, surprise or aha moment for you personally in this process?
I guess there's two things I would say about that. In terms of the the journey that's depicted in the film, the biggest surprise, hands down, is, and I'm not going to give it away either, but I'll say this: my dad and I end up on the doorstep of family we never knew existed, and sometimes I've described it like this: it's like you're in a car on a road trip, you're driving down the road, and this experience was so kind of reality altering. It's like somebody was reaching in and just tearing the horizon off of the sky, and then there's another sort of different horizon, and then that one is getting torn off, and it's a rainy scene, and then there's a sunset. It was just impossible to put into words how everything changed in that moment. And it's almost like time funneled through this hourglass, and there's this kind of stricture in the hourglass at that moment, and all of the past and the future funneled through this single moment in the film, and everything changed. It rippled backwards and forwards at the same time, and I have chills just talking about it now. So that's my answer in terms of the journey of the film. Um, in terms of sharing the film, what surprised me the most is that the film would grow and grow and kind of take on this life of its own. Um, I never thought that kind of sharing my own story, which is really not what I intended to do in the beginning of all this, would impact so many other people, and that would sort of circle back around and be so meaningful to me. And so and my dad, I mean, the transformation in all of us is amazing, and it continues. It's actually the continued sharing of the film doesn't just, I think, impact people who see it, but it really is this sort of circuit of positive experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you describe that, because that's in my experience talking to people, my own personal experience, it's almost like when you begin this journey, you don't realize it at the time. Like, you didn't realize there was this hole. You just felt this is just what life feels like. You assume everybody must feel this way. And
Right,
it's
right.
almost like life is in black and white, but you don't realize you're not seeing colors until colors start getting filled into places. And the further you get, the more filled in the colors become. So I love the way that you described it. I'm also wondering, again, with the spoilers, I wish people watch the movie and then come back and watch this interview. You gave a hint there to finding family that you didn't know existed. And what I was struck by is, as we mentioned earlier in the film, when you first arrived there and your father first revisited the orphanage and was re-smelling things and re-experiencing the ceilings and the walls and just being back there, and it was bringing back all these visceral memories of, not a very happy childhood. And he had a really difficult time where he actually sort of forgot where he was, and you and your mother were actually worried about, was he okay. But then when we get to this spoiler moment later in the film, where it was such a joyous discovery, I mean, I had tears in my eyes watching this, like, oh my god, this is amazing. It's almost like the depths of his pain was balanced out by the depth of the joy that the whole family experienced at this amazing moment.
Lisa, that is so spot on. My producing partner and the co-writer of the film says, and this is really just from observing the story and trying to understand it. She says, it's not quite as eloquent as what you just said, but how far down a character goes is really the measure of how far they can rise later on. And that's really through a storytelling perspective, but I think that's exactly what you just said. And unfortunately, we don't get to know that at the time we're in the depths. But I think that really is true. There is an equal and opposite upside to those experiences if we're able to just stay with it and kind of be present with what's happening.
Right. Well, especially since we're already in the muck. We just don't realize it.
Yeah,
And so that's for me, that's why this work is so important and worthwhile, because there's nowhere to go but up. That
great
if
point.
you
That's
do the
right.
work and you make the effort, you're healing these wounds.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. From that standpoint, we really have nothing to lose.
Mhm.
It can seem like it, but ultimately, kind of through the broader lens, I think it's really only there are really only things to be gained from taking a pursuit like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Obviously, I agree, or I wouldn't be hosting this summit.
I'm sure.
Now, I want to ask you too, because you didn't at the beginning of this journey, you didn't have any idea where to find information. So you started out with no clue and no hope, really, of ever finding any answers. And I know there are a lot of people out there who were either adopted or abandoned, or for whatever reason did not know their parents and don't even know where to begin, aside from doing DNA testing and getting into that whole searching through DNA. Um, what would you recommend to somebody who is in that kind of position where they really just don't have any hope of finding any answers about their family?
The very first thing I would say to anybody in that position is it is completely 100% okay that you would want to know this. So, uh, to spend a little time and validate that kind of impulse in yourself that we all want to know where we came from. I think it's a human right to know that. And when we don't have that, as you say, for whatever reason, I think there's an instinctual drive that compels us toward that.
Mhm.
And so I think to just acknowledge that feeling or that impulse as you're a human being, and we all want that, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to know that. That's a big first step, I think. Um, there's never been more possibility than now for us to connect with ancestors. When my dad and I took this trip, DNA testing was not as developed as it is today, although I don't think we actually would have solved it by DNA, because as it turns out, the family we've discovered hadn't done, they really weren't in the DNA system, and the records, the potential records that we could have found were few and far between. Um, but every family's different. And obviously the DNA testing, family tree building those are all great ways to start. For many adoptees, and I like the term relinquishees because I feel like it really acknowledges the loss instead of the gain. I would say the adoption is the gain and the relinquishment is a loss that happened before that. Um, Birth records are being opened in many states across the country, and we're seeing that change right now at a pace faster than ever before. And so the potential exists to be able to find potentially records about your origins that way. Um, and I think as time goes forward, I think we'll see more and more of these holes fill in. And, these family trees are sort of slowly connecting and growing together. And so I think the more that people pursue this and the more time and technology, I think stories like Father Unknown, maybe 50 years or 100 years from now will be really, hopefully, relics of an earlier time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And uh, since you once again mentioned the name of the film, we've teased it enough, I think. Let's tell
Yeah,
people where they can actually see Father Unknown. It's really easy. You don't have to go to your local movie theater and wear a mask and all that stuff.
right.
So I'll go ahead and share that.
Father Unknown is available from our website, which is fatherunknown.com. And there's a little tab called Watch, and you can rent it or buy it.
Perfect, perfect, easy peasy. Like I said, I watched it and right in the comfort of my living room, and actually, I ended up buying it because you said you can buy or rent it, because I want to watch it again and again and again. It was really
Yeah.
just a wonderful film. I want to thank you so much for sharing your story. As I mentioned when we talked before, I did my own excuse me version of this kind of trip, and I tried to document it on my phone, but I was really self-conscious because I'm not a filmmaker, and I felt a little weird wandering around villages of Scotland with my phone out and having all these people
Sure.
looking at me like I'm crazy. What was that like for you, being a filmmaker and being in these unknown parts and being the person who's documenting and also learning these amazing things? How were you able to have a foot in both worlds?
You nailed it. It actually is, when you have a foot in two worlds, you also really are fully in neither.
Mhm.
And so the trade-off, well, let me just back up and say, uh, because I'm a filmmaker by trade, I'm kind of oriented towards stories and recording things. I'm interested in those sorts of things. But I actually think that one of the other reasons that I may have started recording this on my iPhone is because in the back of my mind, the prospect of me getting on an airplane with my dad and taking a trip for 2 weeks, just he and I talking alone, just him and me, we're going to relate to each other. I think maybe if I have a camera in my hand, I would be a little more comfortable. And also, in a way, having a camera um, can kind of give the person behind it permission to maybe ask things and pursue some things that they might not have the bravery to do without the camera. And so that's a facet of it. I think having the camera kind of made me feel like I had permission to kind of pursue what was really inside of me. And as it turns out, I think it did. Um, so uh, in coming back and looking through that footage, I actually, in a way, was kind of experiencing that for the first time, because when it was happening, I really was thinking about two completely different things all at once. Like, wow, something utterly life-changing is about to happen. 20 seconds from now, we're going to walk through the door and my dad is going to see photos that are going to change his life forever. But I also better make sure this camera is on because I really want to record that moment. And so it does kind of split your mind into two parts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that. One other, I think the last thing I'd like to ask you is, at the beginning of the film, you and your father, you seem to be, you have a connection, you have communication, but by the end of the film, your relationship has really transformed. And I wonder, how is it between the two of you now? How does he feel about, in retrospect, looking back on this trip that you sort of forced him into taking?
Oh gosh, it has completely transformed our relationship. And it's important. I don't want to sell a fantasy, kind of peddle a fantasy here and say, we took this trip and made this film, and our lives are perfect and our relationship is perfect. That's just, we're still human beings, and we still we don't agree on everything. So this is not a magic pill to sort of swallow. That said, um, we've never been this close, and it has really transformed not just my relationship with my dad, but our entire family. And I would say it's a little harder maybe to measure, but our relationships with ourselves. Sometimes I'll look over in the theater. My dad watches the movie every time it screens. He watches it in the theater, and sometimes I'll look over and he is mouthing every word that is said. So it's a very it's, I think, an experience of him kind of being able to affirm his experience and kind of relive how amazing that transformation has been. So it's amazing.
Wow. Such a wonderful story and such a gift that you were able to give to your father and your entire family, both descendants and ancestors, because as you said, this ripples. There are ripple effects going in both directions. And thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for making the film, and thank you for being with us today. I want to check before we wrap this up. Is there anything that maybe we didn't mention, didn't talk about that you think we should talk about before we go?
I don't think so. No. Thanks for the conversation. I really appreciate talking about this, and I loved hearing your story and the way in which it relates to this one. And I think the thing maybe to learn from that is so many of these stories have similar elements in common, kind of at the core level, and I think that's just fascinating.
All right. Well, once again, David Quint, I want to thank you for spending some time with us. Once again, the website is fatherunknown.com. You can rent it or buy it. So, David, thank you. It's been wonderful spending some time with you today.
Thanks, Lisa. My pleasure.
All right. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation in the Ancestral Healing Summit.